Abraham. Abraham responded, and in response, God promised Abraham a large family, God promised Abraham a new homeland, and God promised protection. Those appear in Genesis 12, 15, and 17 if you want to look those up later. But this is a part of the origin story of the Exodus story, and the people that are now in Egypt, these are the promises lingering in their familial, in their ancestral memory. These 3 promises. So those are the 3 promises. Now the 2 fears. There are 2 fears that we see in the Exodus passage from this morning. The first is a fear from Pharaoh. Pharaoh is afraid of a particular people group. Not afraid of what they have done, but afraid of what they could potentially do. The Israelites have done nothing wrong up until this point. But it is the possibility of them aligning themselves with a foreign power that elicits this fear from Pharaoh. The Israelites have lived in this place for many, many, many generations, and this Pharaoh does not remember Joseph. The Pharaoh that was in charge when Joseph was a part of the nation of Egypt had a positive relationship with the Israelites and gave to the Israelites the best land of Egypt, and the Israelites flourished as a result. That Pharaoh who knew Joseph was hospitable toward the Israelites, but this Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph demonstrates hostility towards these people. And fast forward the story now, the Israelites are viewed as a threat. So there's this fear that is driving Pharaoh and these decisions. Now, to think about our contemporary context a bit, there's been a lot of fear in our society around our world today. And some of that has been justified fear, and some of that has also been unjustified fear. We obviously know about the fear that has revolved around our collective health. We got used to Zoom and online meetings and are still doing that, connected to that level of fear. We became familiar with terms like, what is your risk tolerance? And social distancing. Those things became a part of our vernacular because we were justifiably afraid for our health. There was an assault and is an assault on our collective immune systems. And some of our loved ones got sick, and some even passed away. So there is this collective fear that we have been experiencing in our environment, and that is worthy to be acknowledged. There's also been a level of unjustified fear in our world today as well, connected to our pandemic because of political rhetoric and scapegoating the Asian community. There was fear demonstrated towards our Asian brothers and sisters, and unfortunately that metastasized into violence towards our Asian American brothers and sisters, particularly our Asian elders. The resulting violence towards these people was evidence of our figurative sickness that had taken root in our community. And understandably, there was fear then that was being experienced in the Asian community. For those of you who don't know, my wife is an Asian American woman, and she is a petite one at that. So when too many violent acts were being perpetuated towards the Asian community, we felt a measure of fear. And for a time, even though, like I'm sure many of us, we were not leaving our house very often, when my wife did leave the house, she was never leaving alone. And all of that was because of an unjustified fear. at the onset of the Exodus story today, and too many examples throughout history, we see the consequences of unjustified fear that is not rooted in reality. Returning to the scriptures, as I said, there was two fears. There was Pharaoh's unjustified fear, and then there was a fear by the midwives. Pharaoh's fear led to death. The fear by the midwives led to life. Verse 17 reads, "The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live." The midwives, in response to being ordered to kill the Hebrew boys, chose instead to disobey Pharaoh. Now, why did they do this? Now, I used to think that they did this because they were exhibiting some innate value for human life. That is a plausible way of thinking about this. But as I discerned more and listened to the Holy Spirit, I began to question if that was their motivation. You see, having an innate value for life is a fairly modern conception. Life having innate value is a part of our Judeo-Christian values influencing the world. We have in our 10 Commandments, don't murder people. God told us that. And there is a way that our Judeo-Christian values have influenced society. But it should be noted that that commandment hasn't even taken place at this part of the story yet. It doesn't take place for another 20 more chapters. So the midwives are not responding to that. So in addition to our Judeo-Christian values influencing our modern conception of the value of life, our modern conception of the value of life is probably also influenced by our modern medical advances. Throughout much of the history of humanity, the life expectancy of newborns was not very long. That child may survive, it may not. That was a reality for most of human history. And many cultures throughout history would not even celebrate the birth of a child, but rather celebrate that child if that child survived to a certain age, because that culture then deemed it that child is probably going to survive, and now let's celebrate that child. So the innate value of life is probably not the motivating factor that is going on for these midwives and how they choose to disobey Pharaoh and then even lie to Pharaoh about that disobedience. And this is where I think this fear that the midwives are demonstrating interacts with the previous promises that were a part of their community. These are the promises that God had given to Abraham, and those promises are a part, as I said, of the lingering familial ancestral memory of these midwives that has been passed on from generation to generation. They were promised a large family. They were promised a land. They were promised protection. In the second promise, when God promised Abraham protection, God also offered a prophecy. God told Abraham that his people would in fact be strangers in a foreign land. And in that foreign land, they would be enslaved and they would be mistreated. That's from Genesis 15. So these midwives can see that God has proven himself worthy. They are, in fact, in a foreign land, and they are enslaved, and they are being mistreated. God is showing himself faithful to that prophecy, so they are giving legitimacy to this promise. Additionally, these women's vocational role in the community as midwives, they are, in fact, first-hand witnesses to God fulfilling one of those promises. The Exodus text tells us in verse 6 that the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, and they had multiplied greatly, and they were filling the land. That sounds a lot like the promise of Abraham's family being large. God told Abraham, look to the sky. As many stars as you see, that is how big your family will be. And we see echoes of that in our Exodus story right here. And the women, the midwives, are receiving some of God's promises. God is showing God's self faithful to that promise that he gave to Abraham. So in those intimate moments where these women are participating in the birthplaces taking place in their community, these women are given front row seats to God's fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Over and over and over again, they are witnessing and holding in their very hands the evidence of God's faithfulness to Abraham. And their response is reverence and awe and appropriate fear of God. So in those intimate moments, I can imagine these women offering their prayers of thanksgiving to God for the faithfulness God is demonstrating. And that leads them to the faithful response. So we've had 3 promises, 2 very different fears, and 1 faithful response. And in this case, the response is one of defiance. These midwives don't follow the instructions. They cannot and they do not kill the baby boys, because to do so would be in direct opposition to the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham for that large family. They faithfully respond in accordance with the promise of God and defy Pharaoh. So there are 3 promises, 2 fears, and 1 faithful response. And that finally brings us to an in-between hope, what I am calling an in-between hope. The text does not indicate this explicitly, but I wonder if there was a stirring in the hearts of these midwives. That while they were offering those prayers of thanksgiving to God for the fulfillment of that large family promise, they were also offering petitions to God for the yet to be realized promises to Abraham. God has and is giving Abraham that large family, but they are still in Egypt. They do not yet have a new homeland, and they are still enslaved. They are not yet experiencing all of God's protection. So they are living in what I call this in-between time. Promises being fulfilled on one hand, but yet still promises yet unfulfilled. And these midwives, I think, give us a good metaphor for this last season of life for all of us. We have all been experiencing this in-between time. We long for life to get back to some semblance of normal, whatever that will look like. But obviously we are not there yet, and we don't know exactly when we will be. So it is easy to succumb to despair given the uncertainty that is all around us. However, these women give us an example of what it is like to live in this and with this in-between hope. Like these women, I trust that God has shown up for us in various ways in our lives during this last season. So following these women's example, can we also identify the ways that God has shown up for us in this last season of life? And like these women, can we hold in one hand the ways God has shown up, and in the other, the yearning for the particular ways we want God to still show up. And although I think this is a particularly helpful way of helping us navigate this season of pandemic, I also think it's just a helpful way of thinking about our lives with God in general. The fact of the matter is that we are always living in this in-between time where we need to point back to the ways God has shown up in our lives, to have the hope of pointing to the way we want God still to show up in our lives and in the life of our community. We are always living in this in-between time, and can we demonstrate this in-between hope? During this last season of our ministry, we had to transition, like all of us, to online ministry, and none of us knew what was going to take place. There was so much uncertainty around us. One of the things I told my staff, the people that I supervise, was I have zero expectation for what ministry will look like. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I told that to my staff in the attempt to alleviate any emotional and mental strain that expectations could have caused. Expectations are not necessarily a bad thing, but expectations need to be rooted in experience. And none of us had experience of doing ministry during a global pandemic. So I threw all expectations out the window. But God was and is still God. And our team was still responding to the invitation we have collectively received from God to share the story of Jesus to those around us, even though it was going to look very different. Over the past few years, we have been seeing some promising fruit in our ministry to international students from abroad who come to study at our campuses. And we have dedicated ministries to international students at UC Berkeley and Diablo Valley College on the other side of the hills. However, this pandemic absolutely cut the legs out from under that particular ministry. That particular ministry is our most evangelistic ministry that relies heavily on hospitality. And we just couldn't demonstrate hospitality in the ways that we've done in the past. We couldn't invite people into our homes. We couldn't have meals together. We couldn't take day trips to explore the Bay Area. None of that was possible in this last season. So we surrendered our expectations to God for what God would do in this in-between season. And one of our staff, Julie, she oversees our ministry at Diablo Valley College. So she started an online Bible study for Japanese students. Now, this wasn't a very big Bible study, but she got people to come to it because she said, we'll work on our English together. So she had one person who was a Christian in this Bible study who was actually an alumni of our ministry from another campus who is now in that area, and two non-Christian Japanese students, one of which was actually Korean, but she grew up and lives in Japan. Her name is Yoonhae. In our organization, we do something that we call transition interviews. At our four-year institutions, we do a transition interview with a graduating senior, and we talk to them about the next stage of their life and the transition that they will be going through. At our community colleges, we do those transition interviews with students when they graduate or when they transfer from those institutions. So these interviews are an opportunity for us as staff and with the students to debrief what their experience has been like with our ministry and to share with one another how God has shown up in our lives. At Yoonhae's transition interview, she shared how the Japanese Bible study had impacted and challenged her. We knew Yoonhae was on a spiritual journey and taking steps towards Jesus, but in some cases, the international student journey of faith can be a long one. At the end of the interview, Julie asked Yoonhae what she felt like the next step in her journey with Jesus should be. Mind you, all of these interactions for over a year at this point had been all online. To Julie's surprise, Yoonhae responded by asking Julie if she would baptize her. She was ready to declare her allegiance to Jesus, and it needed to happen right away because Yoonhae was getting on a flight back to Japan the next night. So Julie, one thing you need to know about Julie is she is a consummate rule follower. So she sent me a chat message and asked me if it was okay for staff to baptize students. Now, in our organizational culture, we generally do not baptize students because we want that to take place in the context of the church. The church is the community that will be the community that fosters our students' lifelong journey with Jesus. We are yet just a small part of their journey with Jesus, so we generally do not baptize students. But having said that, I know plenty of stories where our staff have baptized students. So I relayed this information to Julie, and then I asked her, "Why are you asking?" She relayed to me the information about the transition interview with Yoonhae and told me Yoonhae's timeline, and I immediately responded to Julie with, do it now. This picture, I think maybe we have somewhere, is a picture of Yoonhae being baptized by Julie. Julie had the opportunity to be a part of the spiritual journey of Yoonhae, where Yoonhae declared her allegiance to Jesus. By this time, Julie was fully vaccinated, so we felt totally comfortable with her doing this outdoors. Our ministry in this past year has and continues to experience God's evangelistic promises to us, and our ministry is holding out hope for a return to demonstrating the hospitality that our international student ministry relies on. Our ministry was and is still in this in-between season, and even so, God's promises are still being fulfilled. This morning, we looked at 3 promises, 2 very different fears, and 1 faithful response during an in-between time. It was this faithful response of defiance that would set the stage as the Exodus story unfolds for more defiance by more women. Moses' mom would send her child in a basket down the Nile. Pharaoh's very own daughter would find Moses and take him as her own, both acts of defiance. And all of this would eventually set the stage for God's protection promise to show up in its fullness. God would protect the Israelites through the plagues and the eventual release from captivity. That promise would be realized, and that journey in the wilderness would eventually lead to the aforementioned promise of a new homeland. God, in fact, has shown himself faithful to those promises that he gave to Abraham for a large family, a new homeland, and protection. And all of that was made possible through these women responding with this in-between hope, where they were seeing glimpses of God's promises realized, but yet all of God's promises realized, and they responded faithfully. As we continue to live in this in-between time, church, my invitation for you is, where has God shown up for you in this in-between season? And how do you need to hold on to that while simultaneously holding on to how and where you want God to continue to show up? Let me pray for us. Father, Son, Spirit, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for your words. We thank you for your promises. We thank you for these women who responded in this in-between time where they saw some of your promises fulfilled, but not yet all of your promises fulfilled. Will you help us, Lord, to recognize the ways that you have shown up in our lives and the way that you are worthy of our trust? Will that be a faith-building exercise for us as we hold out to you the ways that we desire for you still to show up in our lives and in the lives of our community as we live in this season of in-between? Help us to demonstrate this in-between hope. We ask this in the name of your Son. Amen.
Please stand as we sing "It Is Well." Please be seated.
Receive the blessing. May the Lord bless you and take care of you. May the Lord be kind and gracious to you. May the Lord look on you with favor and give you peace. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.